Okay, I am William Joseph Lewis Sr., and I was born on Monday, April 6, 1931, in the old Baton Rouge General Hospital on Government Street in Baton Rouge. The president was Herbert Hoover, the governor was Huey Pierce Long, and the mayor was Wade H. Bynum. Baton Rouge was a sleepy little river town with dreams of greatness, with future plans and the start of a new state capital, an expanded major university south of the city, and turning the old abandoned state penitentiary site into a beautiful downtown park. Streetcar lines covered much of the city, and 3 months later, a new municipal airport would be dedicated on land that had been the Goodwood Plantation at the end of Government Street. Frequent rail passenger service was available to many destinations from the city, and the river was crossed by ferry with distant promises of a new bridge and a 4-lane highway. My father had to prepay the cost of my mother's hospital stay, which was estimated at $39, with provision for refund if it cost less. I have a receipt for his cash payment, but I don't know if there was a refund or not after our week stay. My childhood was spent in rural Blackwater and central area of East Baton Rouge Parish. As modern for the times that the city of Baton Rouge was, life in the rural areas was still much as it had been in the late 1800s, with dirt and gravel roads, no electricity, no telephones, and toilets that were located down paths, and baths and wash tubs on the back porch in summer and in the kitchen in winter. Houses were heated with wood-burning fireplaces, and cooking was done on wood-burning stoves. Homes were cooled by shade trees and open windows and doors. Water came from pitcher pumps on hand-dug wells. Such were my beginnings, and I have attempted to capture them in my stories of life and of times during the Great Depression, during World War II, and in the explosive growth after that war, in an ever-increasing kaleidoscope of change for better or worse during the 88 years that I've been fortunate to witness. I'll start with a story about the night the Baton Rouge ferry almost sank. It's one of my earliest memories. My grandfather, grandmother, teenage aunt, 6-year-old uncle, and 10-year-old uncle, my mother and father and I went in my grandfather's big touring car to Port Allen. I'm guessing now that it was to eat at a restaurant there. On the return ferry ride, we heard a loud noise, and then foghorns, whistles, and bells all started making a terrible racket. The ferry had struck something and opened a hole in the side. The deckhands went from car to car and helped all the passengers to the upper deck as the boat started to list and lean. The pilot fought the swift current and was able to steer the boat until the fast-sinking side of the boat settled to the bottom some distance south of the landing, but still maybe 30 or 40 feet from the levee. All the fire trucks, police cars, and ambulances came, sirens blaring to the raw riverfront. Someone found the boat and rigged ladders from the shore to the boat and from the boat to the side of the ferry. Apparently, we 3 boys were the only children aboard. A big fireman picked me up and carried me down the steps and waded through the water to the fence on the side, and handed me over to another one standing on the walkway the deckhands used, who then carried me across the ladder to a third fireman, who carried me to the shore and turned me over to a policeman, who led me up to the railroad tracks where a fire truck with all its lights on was parked. He told me to sit there and not move while he went back for my uncles, and if I was good, he would get some hot cocoa for us. They apparently had rigged a more stable gangplank to help my mother, who I now realize must have been barely pregnant with my younger brothers, my grandmother and aunt ashore. My grandfather and father stayed behind to help, and we made our way downtown through the crowd to a streetcar stop. which I vaguely remember my teenage aunt waking me and carrying me the several blocks from Terrace and Eugene streets where the streetcar ended to my grandmother's house. I can remember a policeman saying it's a miracle that the pilot was able to get to shore in that current and everyone was safe. They must have decided it was too dangerous to try to come alongside with the other ferry. My grandfather still had his big touring car for several more years, so the dunking must not have hurt the vehicles. I don't think the policeman ever made good on his promise of hot cocoa, though. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I spent much of my time with my grandparents in town. They lived in a home on Letitia Street, which was located several blocks from City Park with its large swimming pool, carousel, zoo, and other attractions for young boys. My uncles, who were 4 and 6 years older than me, let me tag along on their excursions into the fields and woods located beyond Eugene Street behind their home, and to the park whenever we could slip away. They built a soapbox car with wheels from a wagon and a wooden box nailed to a board with a second board attached with a bolt that allowed it to be steered with a rope tied to the end of the front axle and a small board to drag against the rear wheel as a brake. They decided that the test run should take place on the newly blacked out street on the east side of the golf course on the steep slope from the rail crossing to the street along the lake at the bottom. They gave me a running push in the car. I was designated as the test pilot. They gave me a running push and the car flew down the slope, but the brake lever didn't work as planned, and I sailed across the street at the bottom into the shallow edge of the lake, throwing me headfirst into the mud. 3 wet, muddy little boys trudged home, pulling the failed experiment, and tried to clean off with a hose behind the house before any of the adults noticed. To no avail, and we were sent to break off switches from a peach tree, and receive several swipes on the back of our bare legs. We still considered the adventure worth the punishment, though. Hi. While shopping in Wally World several days ago, I was amazed at the frantic young parents with their long list of school supplies and baskets loaded with so many items now apparently necessary for school attendance. The aisles full of goods labeled as back-to-school necessities and the rack of uniforms of the various school colors made me think of my first day of school 80-something years ago. There were no preschool or kindergarten classes offered in 1936, so we were expected to enroll in the first grade in the school year that our 6th birthday fell in. I was born in April 1931, so the Monday after Labor Day in 1936, I eagerly waited for the bus that would take me to a new adventure. Children in all the grades, 1st through 11, all rode the same bus, so I knew the children that lived in our immediate neighborhood. Of those entering the first grade with me, I only knew a few from Sunday school, a girl who lived nearby, and a first cousin. I must have sat on the front steps for an hour before time for the bus to pass, dressed in my new overalls, the shirt that my mother sewed from a pattern made out of cloth from the colorful flour sacks that we used to make dresses, shirts, pillowcases, dish towels, and many of the items found in the homes in those days. They came in several colors, different colors and designs, so while we didn't have school uniforms, there was a great similarity in our dress. My new high-top shoes pinched my feet that were unaccustomed to wearing shoes, but I didn't dare complain. The older boys entertained us with horror stories on the bus, but the older girls took us under their wings and saw that we made our way to the right classrooms. The first grade class was not in the large brick school, but in the teacherage across the road. The school board furnished the home for the school principal, and it had overnight accommodations for teachers stranded by weather or road conditions. 2 rooms on either side of the front porch were classrooms. There were about 20 of us first graders who would share two student desks. They had a single bench-type seat and a desktop with a pencil slot on either side and an inkwell in the center. The boys were paired with boys and the girls with girls, but it didn't work out even, so the smallest girl and the smallest boy, me, had to share the odd desk. That brought with it some teasing of us both, but we became close friends and shared adjoining desks for the rest of our 11 years at Central High School. The state furnished the school supplies, so my big chief tablet and small box of crayons were stored on the small shelf under the desk for us to share. Miss Mahoney, the teacher, escorted us across the road to the large brick school that the other classes were in, and the principal showed the boys where the boys' bathroom was located, while the teacher escorted the girls to their room, which for some reason were called basements, although the building only had one floor. But it was much preferable to the privy behind his house that we were to use in emergencies or inclement weather. Back in class, we were given a pencil supplied by the Coca-Cola Company, which was much superior to those furnished by the state. A ruler that advertised a furniture store, and a thick scratch tablet made of paper similar to that used to print newspapers on. The teacher went to the blackboard and drew a large cursive capital A, followed by a small a. We were then instructed to copy them on the first sheet of paper. That, of course, brought on a series of broken pencil lids that led to being shown how to use a manual pencil sharpener screwed to the windowsill. Several pencils became nubs that first day. We were given two recesses, one called Little Recess, which allowed us to visit the basement and get a drink of water from the pump, with a little time left for a game of tag or just running off a little energy. The other was Big Recess, an hour long, where we sat on benches that circled the trees that were on the school grounds and the principal's yard, and ate the sandwich we had brought from home. That first day I had a biscuit with a muscadine jelly center and a small baked sweet potato and a little paper bag I was expected to fold up and put in my pocket to be reused. We had ample time to get acquainted and played a few games of Simon Says before the bell rang, summoning us back to class. After lunch, we were to copy several lines of the number 1 on a second sheet of scratch paper, which led to another line at the pencil sharpener. Miss Mahoney led us a story about a boy and his dog after we finished our ones. We all went outside about an hour after lunch and played Ring Around the Rosie, Drop the Handkerchief, and London Bridge is Falling Down for what we were told was PE. I was scolded when we turned in our papers to be graded for having added a few B's and C's to my page of A's, and when I told the teacher I could already read, she told me I was not to do so ahead of the class. I had made the connection between the words in the books my mother had read to me and the words she spoke sometime before through trial and error, and asked about the meanings of words, and taught myself to read before going to school. Unfortunately, this led to my being bored with the progress of the class and spending time daydreaming when I should be paying attention. I think my bad study habits started that first day of school. My grades were always just good enough to stay on the honor roll without my having to expend much thought, time, or energy on them. My disappointment at being scolded was compounded by the fact that my seatmate, who was probably smarter than me, asked about the B's and C's I had written and wrote them on her sheet as well, and I had gotten her in trouble. This sealed our friendship and made us friendly rivals as well. When asked what I'd learned at school that day when I got home, my answer was, not much. A day trip to Natchez. My grandfather Lewis always owned newer and better cars than Daddy. In the mid-30s, we had a top-of-the-line DeSoto, which was, at the time, very luxurious. We had owned the Model A Ford, which had to be cranked to start and had button-down windows. When I was 6 or 7 years old, my grandmother, Nana, decided she wanted to visit some cousins who lived in Natchez. I don't know who kept my brothers for the day, but Grandpa, Nana, my Aunt Eloise, Daddy, and Mama and I left before daybreak one beautiful spring morning for a long day excursion in his big car that had a starter and a crank-down windows. Roads, for the most part, were very different then than now in many ways. Most roads were not paved and followed different routes from their present locations. We took the gravel Greasy Bend Road, now called Comite Drive and Thomas Roads, to the paved Biocere Road, now known as the Old Scenic Highway, to St. Francisville. It was paved after a fashion by being graded, graveled, and bounded with an oily finish. Ditches on the sides were non-existent or very deep, depending on the terrain. The road humped in the middle with about a 3-inch drop to the sides for drainage. Bridges were wooden and covered with thick planks which made a rumbling sound when crossed. There were frequent curves, and when we reached the hilly area around Port Hudson, the roads went around the hills or followed the terrain up and down, creating a roller coaster effect. Thompson's Creek was wide and had a single-lane wooden bridge at the bottom of a very steep hill. The bridge had to be replaced after every flood. The road went through the center of the town and continued as the Woodville's Road. There were many more plantations homes along the way than now. Some burned later, some have been torn down or deteriorated and abandoned until they fell apart in the years since then. Nearly all of the larger homes we see in pristine condition now were in sad state of disrepair then. After hours of riding around and over steep hills and crossing many wooden trestles over ravines too deep to cross otherwise, we reached the village of Woodville. The buildings in St. Francisville and Woodville look much like those in the old Western movies, and for the most part dilapidated and unpainted. From Woodville north, the roads were unpaved, dirt or gravel, and wandered from a group of small country stores and a few homes to other like settlements with larger plantation homes, mostly built of wood along the way. The roads were not fenced, and stops to coax cows out of the way were frequent. The post office threatened to cancel postal service from Natchez to Woodville in the early 30s because the roads were so often impassable from mud and high water. They had repaired them somewhat by the time of our journey. The fields along the roads were full of blooming flowers of many colors, and the woods along the way were filled with brilliant white dogwoods, wild plums, mayhaws, and snowbells, bright pink azaleas, wild azaleas, crab apples, and redbuds, also pale yellow locust trees. The yards of the homes and sites where homes had been were all filled with brightly colored azaleas, roses, ladybanksias, narcissus, and wisterias. We stopped at one of the wide streams along the way and ate a picnic lunch of fried chicken that Nana had packed in a basket with plates and cutlery. She spread several quilts on a large sandbar near a small waterfall, and we napped after lunch, lulled by the sounds of the rippling water and the many birds singing in the trees nearby. I remember most having a big shot root beer and a stage plank of my own that Grandpa had bought at one of the little stores to go with the chicken. We arrived in Natchez sometime after lunch and visited Nana's cousins, who lived in a big wooden house that overlooked the Mississippi River in downtown Natchez. They had a wide porch with a number of rocking chairs, and we drank coffee while rocking and catching up on the family news. The house was full of antiques and had high ceilings. It was built on high pillars, and I spent some of my time exploring under the porch for hidden treasures. One could look down the steep bluff to Natchez under the hill below. There were more small stores of all kinds in Natchez then, as well as more large wooden homes, mostly unpainted or with just the fronts painted. Wooden and brick sidewalks were along most of the streets, and the stores all had overhangs that protected the wooden porches and patrons from the elements. A lot of the stores had wooden benches next to the walls, and many had carriage stairs and hitching posts in front. We returned to Baton Rouge by taking the road to Roxy and the hard surface road through Centerville to Clinton, then Plank Road to Baton Rouge. I don't remember much of that route because I slept most of the way, waking briefly when crossing the wooden bridges. It was midnight by the time we got home. The Great Depression and the Civil War took a toll on an area that had been very prosperous in the 1850s, but many tattered remnants of that era were still present in the mid-30s. Highway 61 is now 4-lane and bypasses all the small towns. A one-way trip that took us more than 8 hours then can now be made in under an hour, but so much is missed at 55 miles an hour that was enjoyed at 15 or 20 miles per hour, even with the dust, potholes, and delays. It is nice to see that many of the grand ladies, the large, great plantation homes, have now been refurbished to their early splendor. But I did get to see many that exist no longer, and see the ones that have survived as they look during the painful years after the Civil War. This was a pleasurable memory of a long bygone era. More of my childhood memories. I guess my olfactory senses were not very developed back then because baths were few and far between, particularly in the winter. We did swim in the river a lot in the summer. Electricity wasn't available until REA in the late 30s and early 40s, so we used kerosene lamps for light. The kitchen was kept warm by a large wood-burning stove, and there was always a kettle on to furnish hot water. The living room had a fireplace that furnished the rest of the heat in the house. We did not wear shoes except to school from early spring until it got too cold in the winter. Water was from a well dug in the backyard. My father would use a dowser to find where an underground pool of water bearing sands were located. The well was done with an auger with succeeding lengths of pipe added until the bit would come up wet. The process would be repeated with a larger pipe and bit until the water was several feet up into the pipe. Then it would be raised and the bit removed and replaced fitted with a filter fitting and lowered again. A pitcher pump would be attached to the larger pipe, and it would usually furnish water for years. As the oldest, guess whose job it was to fill the galvanized bucket every morning to be kept in the kitchen for drinking and cooking. The bathroom was located some distance from the water well and was a two-holer. One small for little bottoms and an adult-sized one. Last year's Sears Roebuck catalog would serve as wipes and reading material while waiting. In the winter, this would have to be a hurried affair because your bottom could get quite cold. We carried water from a pond that was located near the house in buckets to water Daddy's garden. A real fun job was going back and forth with the two heavy buckets. I don't know which we felt more, the winter when you woke up with ice on the windows and no heat in the house until the stove and fireplace heated up, or the summers with the only fans being those furnished at church by the funeral homes and the needed exertion of hand power to use. The trip to the necessary in the winter required unbundling to an extent, but with the one-piece underwear of the time had a trapdoor seat that unbuttoned so you didn't have to completely undress to go. It was also a fun job to carry the hot kettle to the pump to thaw it out, to pump the freezing water to replenish the kitchen supply. We did enjoy crawfishing with a string tied to a stick with a piece of salt meat tied to it. We always threw the crawfish back so we could catch them again. The pond that was used to water the cows, furnish water for the garden, was a good crawfish hole as well. I know these sound like the good old days, but believe me, I prefer to buy milk and eggs at the store. I appreciate central air and heat and electrical appliances such as dryers, refrigerators, stoves, and microwaves that provide instant heat for cooking. I probably even appreciate the lack of bodily odors and cleanliness that we take for granted now. I'm going to write my thoughts about this one and stop for a while before everyone gets too bored. I'd promised my niece that I would say a little about Nana and Grandpa, to explain who all the aunts and uncles were and not counting cousins. Grandpa was the second of 2 boys and 2 girls. The oldest was Uncle Richard, then Grandpa Joe Brown Lewis, then Aunt Ruby Calloway, and Aunt Ida Sibley. Uncle Dick inherited the home place but allowed his Aunt Carrie Brown and later 2 of his elderly Loudon cousins, they were bachelors and served in the Confederate Army, to live there because he lived in New Orleans. Nana, his real name was Livilla, had sisters Shug, I think her name was Ella, like my grandmother dear, Cora, Aunt Louise Halsey, and brothers Jack, Frank, Lewis, and Seymour. These were the porch rockers that visited on Sundays. We had high ceilings in the house, and the living room fireplace shared a chimney with fireplace on the other side in Nana's bedroom. At Christmas, Grandpa would cut an 8-foot pine for the Christmas tree, which took up most of the northwest corner of the living room. The decorations were late 1800 and early 1900 glass ornaments from Germany. No lights, of course, until the 1940s. The extended family would gather on Christmas Eve and exchange gifts. Every child got gifts from everyone. Nothing expensive because of the times. Socks, marbles, wooden spinning tops, kite string were some of the favorite presents. There would be cakes, pies, popcorn balls, pull taffy, and plenty of eggnog, spiked and plain, on the large dining room table. The dining room was located through glass doors off the living room with the kitchen on the other side. The 2 fireplaces in the front and another in great-grandma Deer's room, plus the enormous wood-burning stove in the kitchen furnished the heat for the house. When great-grandma Deer died, they put the coffin on sawhorses in the living room and held an all-night wake at home. Food from everyone and coffee was on hand all night. Nana and Grandpa would take my cousin and Roy and I with them when they went to town on Saturdays. Grandpa always had a larger and newer sedan than Daddy. We would go from Crest to Woolworth's to Dalton's, J.C. Penney's and Sears, all with entrances on the 3rd Street. My cousin Roy and I would be rewarded for carrying packages with lunch at Crest and after 1940 in the new and original Piccadilly. One of our favorite stores was J.C. Penney's because when you paid for a purchase, the money would be placed in a small container which would be carried up and away on the second floor balcony by continuous running double strings. The cashiers would send you change and a receipt back to the clerk. We loved watching the little containers flying through the stores. We usually stopped out on Main Street at Tobias Gas Hardware, seed, feed, and everything store, and Rice's Grocery on Plank Road at the end of Well Avenue. They sometimes let us pick some candies from the large jar of candies on the counter. If we were going to do an extended amount of shopping, we were given 5 cents to splurge on a Western at the Louisiana Theater, and we would meet them at the clock that I think is still on 3rd Street. The front porch had a swing on the east end with a rose trellis behind it that had a climbing yellow rose that seemed to be always blooming. There was a large clump of some kind of sweet-smelling plants that grew about 3 feet high and bloomed all summer, scenting the western end of the porch. I've never seen them anywhere else or since. There was a goldfish pond lined with brick and about 18 inches deep in the front yard. Every few minutes, one of the aunts would be warning children about falling into the pond, so naturally one of us would at the first chance. Grandpa was way ahead of his time with growing plants and flowers in outdoor rooms framed with walls of pampas grass or ligustrum or camellias. The back porch was shaded by a large China ball tree, which provided us with ammunition for the pop guns we made from the trunk of elderberries that grew along the garden fence at the rear of the pear orchard and resplit and whittle oak stovewood plungers. There was a row of pine trees in the yard to the east of the house, which provided shade and later poles for the yard to the east for lights for the badminton court. A hard-packed clay court for tennis was located across the road. It had a permanent net, high backstops, and benches along the side for kibitzes. A row of camper trees grew across the yard along the road. They were great climbing trees. There were still plenty of lawn that seemed to get larger every time my cousin Roy and I mowed it with a heavy push mower. We were paid 10 cents each when we completed the entire yard. It was a great place to play hide-and-seek with all the shrubs and rooms. My favorite place to hide was a big clump of 20-foot-high banana trees, which grew close enough together that you could squeeze through to hide in the center of the clump. The bananas would ripen before the first freeze, only once in a while, but when they did, they were delicious. I have enjoyed retrieving some of the memories and hope they give an idea of the life at my grandparents' in the 30s and 40s. Christmas in early Baton Rouge, in rural Baton Rouge in the 30s. Christmas was celebrated a little differently when I was a child. We didn't exchange gifts at school, but would have homemade Christmas decorations in the classrooms and a Christmas party with cookies, popcorn balls, and lemonade furnished by the mothers. We would learn carols in the weeks before and always had a Christmas pageant that the entire school would take part in. That included a nativity played by the high school kids and school chorus and band. Each grade would participate in the program with songs or skits about Christmas. At home, we would take a trip to where the pine trees had been cut on a friend's land and seedlings were reaching Christmas tree heights. After searching through hundreds of the small trees, we would agree on one that was not too misshapen. It would be decorated with the delicate glass ornaments and icicles saved from previous years, painted pine cones, garland of holly berries strung on thread, and later in the 1940s, after electricity was introduced, with strings of lights, always with a homemade tinfoil star on top. There would be a large sprig of mistletoe hung over the doorway. Popcorn for garlands and popcorn balls was popped in a metal basket with a long handle held over the fire burning in the living room fireplace, and the freshly cut pine scent would waft through the house. The weekly Saturday trip to 3rd Street was special in December because that was when we could do our shopping for small gifts for our relatives at Cress. Our hoarded nickels and dimes saved from odd jobs would be spent on handkerchiefs, needles, scarves, and other small items in the 5 and 10 cent range for our parents and grandparents. These were carefully wrapped in tissue paper and placed under the tree at home, and great secrecy would be involved. Those trips into town would allow us to see the Christmas decorations in the store windows and visit the basement of Montgomery Ward's that would have Santa Claus sitting in a chair at the bottom of the stairs. The entire basement would be filled with toys that we could admire and dream about, but never ask for. Our parents always knew what we wanted most, but it was still a surprise when we saw them on Christmas morning. The church would have a large Christmas party where each person would bring a small, inexpensively wrapped gift and placed under the big tree decorated for the occasion. Every child got an apple and a bag of candy plus a wrapped gift from the Santa who always showed up with fanfare after the carols had been sung and the Christmas gospel read by the minister. After the gifts had been distributed, the tables full of cakes, cookies, and platters of fudge and divinity candies and punch would be uncovered, and all the children would be showing their gifts to their friends. The older boys would try to maneuver the girls on the mistletoe hung on the door facings, to the teasing and laughter of all. Christmas Eve would find us at our grandparents' house. Their large Christmas tree was always special, taking up a corner of the living room and surrounding by the gifts for all the cousins and aunts and uncles. Every child would receive small gifts from every aunt and uncle and our grandparents. It might be a pair of socks or a bag of marbles or a spool of kite thread, but each received happily and with thanks. We usually each got a picture puzzle from our grandparents, who always had a small table in the corner of the living room with a partially finished puzzle in progress. Eggnog was the drink of choice with the adults, getting theirs from a different bowl for some reason. Another custom after the dining room table full of cupcakes, platters, and sweet popcorn balls riddled with peanuts and plates of fudge, pecan pandas had been sufficiently rated was a taffy pull. There's nothing to compare with molasses taffy candy that had been repeatedly pulled and wrapped over and over until it reaches just the right texture to savor and lasts like an all-day lollipop in your mouth. When we returned home, it was to find that our gifts had been delivered while we were at our grandparents'. The stockings we had hung would be filled with apples, oranges, and nuts, and the unexpected bicycle, tricycle, or Red Ryder BB gun or radio flower wagon would be sitting in the middle of the floor in their splendor. After a mug of hot cocoa and last-minute thank yous and comparing gifts, it was off to bed with happy thoughts. Nice memories of days long gone. As the enrollment grew during World War II, Central High School had to add more classrooms. They built a wooden frame 4-classroom unit between the old school and the gym. The area behind the gym was swampy and wooded, so they decided to drain it with a ditch at the end of the racetrack. The ditch became a sizable pond which retained water most of the year in the far northeast corner of the grounds. When I was in the 4th grade in the big building, we ate our lunches on benches around the trees behind the new building. About 20 of the boys in the 4th and 5th grades decided to check out the pond one day and discovered it was full of crawfish. The next day, some of us brought bacon sandwiches and string from home and made crawfish lines with bits of bacon for bait. We got caught up in the activity which evolved into a dirt war when we tired of catching crawfish, so we didn't hear the bell ring, and a group of boys were found to be AWOL from afternoon classes. The principal, Mr. Smith, came storming across the racetrack with his Board of Education under his arm and marched us all to his office. The line of apprehensive little boys stretched out into the hallway. He started with the bigger boys with 3 licks across the bottoms and worked down to the boys until he reached the other small boy in the class, Billy Davis, and me. We were the smallest of the group and terrified of our prospects. He got up from his chair and closed the door. Towering over us, he held us in his glare for a minute or so, then he laughed, hit his hand loudly a few times to the paddle, and told us not to tell the other boys, but to go to class and try to stay out of trouble in the future. We walked out of the office holding our bottoms and with long, sad faces. The other boys were waiting and said to us we were really brave to not be crying because we must have really been popped from the sounds of the paddle they could hear through the door. It's the closest I ever came to being punished with it in the 11 years I was there, which is somewhat of a record of itself. Am I the only one left who remembers the school buses we rode to Central in the mid-30s? They had 3 long wooden benches that the students sat shoulder to shoulder on. When the driver stopped, everyone slid forward, and when he accelerated, everyone slid back along the bench with the ones on the end in danger of falling off. The windows had to be down to allow airflow, but they also allowed billows of dust to cover everyone because the roads were all lightly gravel or dirt. After a rain, the roads would look like canals, and everyone took off their shoes to wade from the bus to driveways, and the bus would frequently slide in the mud to stops. The buses were owned by the drivers and covered routes of many miles on the gravel roads and dirt lanes of Central School District, which ran from Plank Road to the Amite River and from near Pride to the south of where the airline would eventually be built. The cold weather reminds me of the cold school days of the 30s. It seemed that we got to 20-degree and lower temperatures every year back then. The combination grade and high school building at Central was heated by a coal-fired furnace and radiators. Mr. Oquan was a sole janitorial service and maintenance man. He would stoke up the furnace very early on freezing days and keep the furnace going all day. The two classrooms in Mr. Smith's home were heated by coal upright pot-bellied iron stoves with a door on the side to add fuel from a coal shuttle. Students would be assigned to refill the scuttle from a big pile of coal on the side of the house and add to the fire as needed. It was considered an honor by the boys to be assigned this duty as well as cleaning the chalk erasers. Either job would result in you being either covered in coal or chalk dust. Of course, it made it easy to see who had which honors for the day. Valentine's Day brings to mind the little packets of cards we would buy at Crest when we were in grade school in the 30s. Each child in a class would buy one of the packets with the teacher slipping some quietly to the few children who she knew were going to be unable to afford the 10-cent charge for them. We would pick through the little cards with big-eyed cartoon children and a clever or funny saying on one side and a to and from section on the back, and carefully choose the right cards to send the extra good ones to special friends. I often wondered how the teacher could show excitement and surprise at receiving 20 of the identical teacher cards that were included in every pack. Every child would receive a card from every other classmate. Simple and pleasant times. In the mid-years of the Depression, about 1937, most of the men in our area were out of work. Daddy worked at Standard Oil, and so did Grandpa Lewis. The local red and white store was located at the junction of Blackwater and Core Roads and was owned by the parents of my sister's future husband. They would put the names of all their patrons in a weekly drawing for a large basket of groceries. Everyone ate mostly homegrown, fresh, and preserved fruits and vegetables, so a can of pork and beans or pineapples was a treat. A small crowd would gather in front of the store for the Saturday afternoon drawing. One Saturday, my father's name was drawn, but we went home with an empty basket. When I asked about it, he told me, "Son, I had the fun of winning. And while we could have used the groceries, we didn't need them as bad as many of those hoping to win. So I had the double pleasure of sharing." Besides, I had a lot of uses for a large basket. The rest of the story was a few weeks later. Grandpa Lewis's name was drawn, and when he got home and told Nana the good news, she asked, "Where are the groceries?" And he explained, well, he dropped them off at so-and-so's home on the way home. I'm proud of both my father and my grandfather. They were both gentle and kind men. We should all be remembered so. Families in Baton Rouge have always loved their picnics. From early days, the Amite and Comite rivers offered clear water and sandbars to attract outings. I've recently read accounts of Montesana Bay also being used for picnics by families in the mid-1800s until the early 1900s. Stories of buggies parked on the trees on the banks while families fished and rested on the large shade trees and buggy rides out the Bayou Road to favored spots on the bayou. The Union commander in Baton Rouge wrote in a dispatch to General Banks during the siege of Port Hudson that he was certain that radical partisans were meeting under the guise of family picnics along Montesana Bay. My memory of childhood picnics is centered on the Comeet River on property owned by the Lewis families in the 30s. My grandparents, parents, brothers and sisters, along with the aunts, uncles, cousins, would converge early with baskets of goodies, blankets, fishing tackle, soda pops, jars of tea and lemonade, watermelons, and so forth on a great wide sandbar on a curve in the river. In those days, the water was crystal clear and full of fish. The children would change into their swimsuits behind the bushes that grew near the edge of the sand, and on the supervision of one or more of the adults, the younger children would play in the water in areas deemed safe by the adults, while the older children would cannonball or belly flop from the steep bank into the deeper water that flowed on the side away from the sandbar. The soda pops, watermelons, and jars of lemonade would be placed in shady spots where the water was flowing faster to cool in the swiftly moving water where logs had blocked some of the flow. When Grandpa decided it was time to eat, the baskets of fried chicken, containers of coleslaw, boiled corn, and cornbread would be placed on blankets spread under a shade tree. The bottles of pops and jars of lemonade would be fished from the water and passed around. After everyone had eaten their fill, the baskets and containers were moved and the children were asked to nap on the blankets while the older kids and adults would tell tales and relax until Grandpa announced that the mandatory hour of rest after eating was up and the water sports could commence. Kids would hold about mid-afternoon, the watermelons would be cut into slices, and everyone would eat them without utensils. The kids would hold seed-spitting distance contests and foot races in the sand until it was time to pack up and trudge home, tired, sunburned, and happy. Usually the teens would be carrying a sleepy child. If I close my eyes, I can almost feel the breezes in the hot sand, smell the fresh air, and taste the crisp fried chicken and dripping sweet watermelons, and hear the laughter of the children playing and the drone of conversation of the adults. And it brings a smile to my face. Central, or any of the other schools for that matter, did not have a school cafeterias in the 30s and 40s. That was before school lunch programs were offered. Instead, about noon, the classes were suspended for an hour and all the students went outside with lunches they'd brought from home. All the trees on campus had benches built around them. Everyone found a bench and usually with a close friend or two ate lunch picnic style. Depending on the finances at home, that would range from sandwiches of peanut butter and jelly on wholesome to wolf sunbeam bread, and a fruit to a baked sweet potato and a biscuit or a piece of cornbread. Everyone was allowed to cross Sullivan Road to go to Edwards Grocer if they had any change and could buy a moon pie and a soda pop if they wished. In 1946, a small concrete block building was built on the south side of the auditorium, and a cafe opened by Mr. Poche with school board permission to serve lunches for 25 cents to any who could afford them. When the weather was too bad, the lunch hour would be shortened and everyone ate at their desk. But since the school day ended at the same time, the extra time from the lunch hour would be spent during the day's homework assignments or getting help from the teacher on a one-to-one basis with subjects you might be having difficulties with. Starting in the late 40s, several of the older boys who were talented guitar, fiddle, and banjo players would stage impromptu country and western concerts under the trees after they finished eating. The younger boys would break out marbles and the girls would jump rope or sit and giggle at the boys' antics. No one complained about cafeteria food, eating lines, or regimented eating by classes as the students would in later years. Instead, everyone had the same lunch hour where they could visit with friends, flirt, or just enjoy the fresh air with a book alone if they chose. The teachers, except for those assigned half-hour stints as schoolyard monitors on a rotational basis, were able to have an hour of freedom also. Since all classes were out at the same time, the teachers would only have to surrender a half hour every week or so. Lunch hour was a good break for everyone. I preferred it that way, and I'm sure the teachers did. Mr. Sandifer was our biology and chemistry teacher at Central in the late 1940s. During one of the early biology classes, he told us we would be dissecting bullfrogs at some point in the class. He would have to order them from a supply company, and while we were waiting for them to arrive, we would be learning what to look for in the textbook. Several of the boys in the back of the class put their heads together and then asked him if the school was going to have to pay for them and how much they were going to cost. To our minds, the price he stated was an outrageous sum. So the boys asked if they could bring in enough of them, would he be willing to pay 25 cents per frog for them? Classroom budgets were lean even back then when schools were actually being funded. So Mr. Sandifer agreed to buy them from the boys, and the boys were going to catch them over the weekend in some ponds by the Amite River. Monday morning, the boys showed up with a big box containing 25 bullfrogs. When Mr. Sandifer opened the box, 25 giant bullfrogs hopped out and headed for the exits, aided and abetted by shrieking girls and boys trying to catch them again. Several made them into the hall and into the classrooms across from the lab, raising another chorus of screams. When order was restored, the boys explained, he never said he wanted them dead. If I could revisit some days in my life, the following would be one of them. Daddy, John Halsey, and I would drive to a spot near the Comite Bridge on Dyer Road where we would launch John's boats, loaded with an ice chest filled with drinks, sandwiches, and maybe a few apples or bananas, followed by our fly rods and some cane poles, an empty oatmeal box with catawba worms, a can of Wrigley's, and tackle boxes. The morning would be one of crisp fall days with blue skies and a north wind with just a hint of the cool days to come. We would wade and drift down the river with numerous sandbars and lazily fish in some of the deeper holes behind a fallen log under an overhanging tree with ripe muscadines falling from vines hanging over branches over the water, making plopping sounds and attracting fish from the depths. We would pass fields with cows curiously watching us drift by from the high banks, or masses of wild blue ageratums or purple ironweed, or even more bright yellow daisy-like sunflowers. The water would be crystal clear and ripple in spots, and others move slowly under a haze with butterflies and mosquito hawks with glossy wings and little flags dancing circles above. Herons would be doing their own fishing in the shallows. After several hours, we would pick a nice sandbar to sit and eat our lunch on, and then fish and drift until we reached the bridge on Comite Drive about mid-afternoon. I would stay with the boat while Daddy and John would walk to our house for Daddy to take John to retrieve his car and trailer. Then they would return to get me in the boat. If I close my eyes, I can still see and hear the startled wood ducks, the birds singing, and the distant sound of cawing crows, and feel the cooling breezes and breathe the fresh, clear fall air. We would have a cooler full of brim bass and blue catfish to load into the car and have fried fish, hush puppies, and coleslaw for supper. Pleasant memories. When I went to work for Delta Airlines many years later, the first things I had to buy were Navy officer's uniform. Winter blues, complete with officer's peak hat with braid. Delta furnished an emblem, black, but black ties, white dress shirts, and black dress shoes were on us. There was a problem with my income, but I managed with military surplus stores and ex-Delta employees. The company did not furnish their uniforms. They did pay for a radio operator's license, however. The preparation for this was to read a list of words you could not say on the airwaves and signing the application. Everyone in the station had to be licensed to handle the radio. The VHF radio was the most used. It was line of sight with a line of about 300 mile range of about 300 miles. We talked with the pilots that were flying over Louisiana or Mississippi and sometimes part of Texas, Arkansas, and Alabama using the VHF radio. We also had a high-frequency radio that covered most of the eastern part of the United States. Baton Rouge was considered a slow operation city by Delta. They thought we had more time on our hands and could spend more time relaying flight messages. Delta would be paid by the other carriers for any radio calls we handle, so we were encouraged to answer all calls. It was not unusual for us to chat with TWA, Pan American, Capital, Braniff, and other airline pilots and relay in flight instructions from ATC centers and reading weather reports and so forth. When we experienced problems with the radio, we would go to a little shack, a 12 by 12 foot building with a door and one window to determine the problem. Radios in those days were large units of multiple bulbs, wires, and so forth. This was before transistors and microchips. As none of us had a clue how to fix a radio, we had boxes of various bulbs and ports on shelves that covered one of the walls. The shack was located under the water tower, which was the tallest structure at Ryan Airport, and bristled with antennas from all three of the air carriers serving Baton Rouge. We would first see if any bulbs were obviously burned out. Then we would feel all the bulbs to see which were cold and which were warm or hot. This was a process that was similar to finding the burned-out bulb in an old-fashioned string of Christmas tree lights. You kept replacing bulbs until they all lit up. I was going through this process one morning and periodically calling through the microphone in the shack to anyone listening to determine if I could be heard. I would repeatedly say, "This is Delta Baton Rouge remote calling for a radio check. Can anybody read me?" After changing a few more bulbs, I would try again, and finally I got an answer. "Delta Baton Rouge remote, this is Delta Flight 602 over Cincinnati, reading you loud and clear, 4x4, now shut up." One day at Delta, we noticed a cat was hanging around the terminal. She was very friendly and seemed to prefer the Delta agents. We started feeding her, and she would repay us by guarding the sacks of mail awaiting flights by sleeping on top of them on the cart that we used to wheel to the plane. She would wander around the office at will and was fascinated by the paper emerging from the teletype machines and activities going on in the office. When not on the mail cart, she would nap on top of the operations counter and supervising and filling out of forms. The airport manager could not stand her and kept telling our station manager to get rid of her. He told us we should choose one of us to take her home or the airport was going to send her to the pound. One morning, one of the agents noted the airport manager walking on the ramp towards our office, so he put the cat in the luggage bin of a New Orleans-bound flight. The planes were not pressurized, and the luggage bin was really part of the cabin behind the passenger section, so the cat probably had more seat room than the passengers. The agent sent a message giving the passenger count and weights and added a 10-pound cat to the count. She was just as friendly with the agents in New Orleans, who were just as kind and dressed just like the ones in Baton Rouge. Plus, their office was next door to the airport restaurant, and the food choices were much more upscale. That night, when the last flight to Baton Rouge arrived, the cat jumped out of the bin and scurried off to wherever she spent the night. The New Orleans agents had sent her back. This went on every day for about a week, days in New Orleans and nights in Baton Rouge. Then one morning, the cat followed an agent to the plane and jumped to the bin on her own, and did the same thing that night in New Orleans. The flights nearly always parked at the same gates, and I do